Yeah, I'm getting better.
I'll be here.
Doubtful. And we call ourselves Click and Clack.
We know you know who that is.
Treat is Click and I'm Clack.
Okay.
We've looked at this as our bad chance to be DJs being realized finally.
Well, I think you guys are, this is an exciting thing.
The students are great though. You've already got 18 in the waiting room, so there.
How many students are enrolled total?
We should have about 30 online today.
Okay.
21 now. We start at 10:02.
We start at 10:02 because everyone forgets that Zoom always needs to update. And
I know, that's why I logged on early.
You got this. You got it.
we have been very excited. Obviously, I love this topic.
Well, we'll see if you love it afterwards. You
I
know,
also love coming from a development NGO. I absolutely loved what the first piece had to say about the ungroundedness of some NGO desires for the organic world.
Now you'll see us scribbling and
Because I've
everything.
done this.
We're grading during this, so don't.
Yeah, we're marking down who's made a comment, whose questions are in, all those things.
would you prefer me to leave my camera on or to turn camera off while I'm lecturing?
That's up to you, man.
Leave it on if you'd like, and I'm going to spotlight you so that it's a bigger picture of you running beside the presentation.
Okay, and I have not sent you this presentation, but I can immediately afterwards for you to post.
Oh, thank you.
I apologize you didn't get it in advance.
That's okay.
I did finish it by midnight last night.
So, put Jeremy's up, I'll look.
I don't know. All right, we got 27 in the way, 25 in the waiting room. We're almost there. I'll let them in about a minute.
Okay.
And they are good, and
We'll be there, but
they will sustain, you know, you're giving your presentation, then we take a 15-minute break at about 11:30. And then they will volley questions at you. You will not have to worry.
yeah.
Okay. I can go straight till 11:30. Do we need
Yeah.
to stop? Okay.
Yeah,
And handle it, you know, however you want to do it. If we have, you know, the Honors College philosophy is, if you are having the best possible time, they will have the best possible time.
Are they
Yeah.
allowed to ask questions in chat during the lecture?
Absolutely, if you
absolutely.
want, or you can have them shout out questions too, however you want it.
I'm going to say they can put things in chat and I'll respond. You know, I've taught online in this environment a lot, so I'm comfortable doing that.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they're very question oriented. So
I haven't had to teach online in a year, and it's coming back to it when you're not having to do it has actually been pleasant. And for a class for kids from throughout the state about this, it's reminded me of all the good things about it.
all right, I'm letting them in. You ready? We
Okay.
got 30. All right, here we go.
31, we're both in 33.
Yep, we're
So-
fine.
We're about where we should be.
All right, greetings, farmers.
Dun-dun-dun-dun.
Dun, 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 dun.
Of course, that's a lot of fun though.
Good morning. It's our last day with Click and Clack. And it's sad for us because we have certainly enjoyed your brilliant work in this class, and the faculty have been exceptional. Today is no exception. I bring to you my good friend and colleague, Professor Curt from the Department of Agricultural College, from the Department of Horticulture, currently serving as Dean of the Graduate School, but still finding time to beam in here and edify us on ethical issues swirling around agriculture. Curt Rome is a university professor with a distinguished research career in horticulture. He's an expert on fruit. He has great knowledge of organic farming, and he was part of a team that taught Honors College signature seminar, Food Matters. Curt Rome in horticulture partner with Jenny Pop in agricultural economics and Margaret McCabe, Dean of the Law School and an expert in food law. And they interrogated a whole series of interesting questions about what you're actually putting into your body right now in terms of eating and drinking. So I'm going to turn the control over to my esteemed colleague, who's a brilliant lecturer, by the way, and will bring us home and continue to amaze. So take it away, Professor and Dean Curt Rome. Let's give him the big woo!
Well, thank you very much, Dean Kuhn. I hope that you can see my PowerPoint screen. Is that okay? Is that true? Okay. Well, we'll get going then. Glad to have you here today. It's really exciting to finish up this class. I know you've had a lot of interesting and exciting topics in the class so far. I mean, you've talked about the philosophy of STEM ethics and medicine and gene editing and health and climate and supply chain. And yesterday it was space, and today we're really grounded on Earth. Now, a lot of these topics that you've had previously are going to come back into our conversation today. So let's get going. And today we're going to talk about the farming biofix. If I can get my screen to move forward here, so that you know my background a little bit. Dean Kuhn mentioned my academic background, and it is in horticulture. My academic background really started on the farm. So I grew up on a small local family farm. We had 10 acres, of which about 4.5 was committed to an orchard. And so there's a young scientist in the making in this picture. And then in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of myself. Now that picture is actually 30 years old, and you can see there's a difference in hair color. And my father was also an agriculture professor and professor of horticulture. We have both studied fruit trees, particularly apples. So my career studying apples and fruit trees was also my a hobby for my family and where I grew up, because we produced apples for local sale. The picture in the bottom is my family selling at the Fayetteville Farmers Market, which was, by the way, is the #1 farmers market in the United States, voted several times for that. So that's my father. He's now 100 years old. In this picture, he was about 89 years old. And my 2 daughters, both were products of the Honors College and have both gone on to very distinguished careers in their own right. But we sold locally. We sold our produce at the farmers market. Then I went on to graduate school, to college. I graduated from the University of Arkansas, and then I went on to graduate school at Ohio State University. And then I had my first career position at Washington State University, and I moved back to the University of Arkansas 33 years ago. I tell you all of this so that you can understand, as you've discussed and learned previously this in the last 2 weeks, ethics have a perspective to them. They have a personal base to them. And so when I talk today, you're going to hear some of my personal thoughts, some of my perspectives, some of my opinions. And those perspectives have been crafted by growing up on a family farm where we tended the land and tended plants, and a 3-generational operation where we sold to our community and we had a role in our social fabric in the city of Fayetteville. And so I look at farming and farming ethos and agro ethics, both from a scientific perspective as well as this personal background and kind of perspective. Okay, so I called this lecture the biofix. And if any of you are biologists, you wondered what the heck was I saying, because I have misused the term. A biofix in biological sense means a point in time or a benchmark by which we measure other events. So in these pictures here, I'm using an apple blossom, state flower of Arkansas for you. If you didn't know that, you need to know that. And so here I have 2 biofixes. The first one on the lower left, we'll call that pink stage of an apple blossom. And on the right, we call that king blossom open. And both of those would be biofixes. And so we would start counting days for an operation or counting biological events from those biofix. So I'm not using the term biofix today appropriately, but I really wanted to think about, is there a fix to our food system or a fix to our interaction between the food system and environment that can have an ethic base to it. So that's really what I'm talking about. I'm misusing the term, but let's go ahead and kind of misuse it for the rest of the morning. What do I hope that we accomplish today in this conversation we're going to have? The first thing that I want is I hope that I can acquaint you with some of the dynamic aspects of our agricultural food system and the decision-making that goes into that, and how decisions are made and the complexity of those decisions. As an outcome from that, I hope that you'll understand some of the ethical issues that are faced by those involved in the food system. You'll understand some of the complexities of the issues, the sides of the issues, and I hope that through our conversation, you'll be able to feel like you can discuss some of these issues, understanding the complexity, the perspectives, and an ethical base for it. So when we talk about agriculture and farming, we're really talking about the production of food, fiber, and fuels, and we can also add pharmaceuticals to that. Now, this business, this industry, or this collection of enterprises really is a resource-based process. It's based on the land resource, the water resource, and the air resource, with additional inputs of technology and chemicals and fertilizer. It also employs people. So there is this biological element, there is this environmental element, and there's this human sociological element that we have to think about. So agricultural ethics, or what are sometimes lumped in as agroethics. This is kind of an emerging new field in probably the last 30 years, 3 decades or so. It's an emerging field of study. It's influenced by culture, demographics, science, technology, public opinion, and politics. And you've heard that for the last 2 weeks. So the real questions that we're going to kind of try to wrestle with today, is there a right way and a wrong way? Because that's what ethics is about, trying to delineate right and wrong and trying to understand how does that apply to this production of food, fiber, and fuel that we have. So to kind of set a stage, I'm going to assume that you know nothing about agriculture, and I apologize for those of you that do. But let's start at the beginning. Can we kind of create a sense of understanding about the farming enterprise? Farming, as we think about it today, or agriculture as we think about it today, was part of the Neolithic revolution. It probably occurred around 12,000 to 10,000 BCE. We see during this period of time the development of tools and the use of kind of advanced tools, pottery, metallurgy, etc. During this period of time is the first domestication of animals, probably goats, sheep, cattle, as long as commensal animals, dogs and cats. We also see the domestication of foods and food crops. Probably the first food crops domesticated were wild grasses, what we call grains. We started to plant those intentionally instead of going out and grazing. We used to be a migratory grazing species, this hunting gathering species, and we would follow the seasons and move where we would find food sources. But now all of a sudden we've started to domesticate those and plant them intentionally. What I mean by domestication is that we are intentionally taking care and cultivating an animal or a plant exclusively for our use, not as part of a wild community, but as part of our community for our use. Originally, these early farmers, they were subsistence farmers. They used early farming to be part of a diet that was still based on hunting and gathering, but as they could domesticate more and grow more locally close to their residence, then they would have to hunt less and gather less. And so there was this subsistence, the roots of subsistence farming. This went on for millennia, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 years. As we continued this domestication process, this migratory species of humans, these hunters and gatherers, became sedentary. We built homes. And in fact, we created communities, and we had neighbors in clans, and we were no longer nomadic. We suddenly started to find a place, and that place was where we could grow plants for our food and raise animals for our food. And in fact, maybe this is the roots of agricultural ethics. What happened if my family had an extra goat, a goat that we knew we couldn't use, and since there's no way to keep it, maybe I'll offer it to my neighbor as a ethical goodwill to my neighbor whose goats unfortunately got eaten by other animals and they were hungry. Or I produced more grain than my family needed, and there's really no way I can keep some of it, but I had more than I need, and maybe I would see others that didn't have as much grain. Or in fact, maybe I would think that my grain had value, that I would trade my grain for my neighbor's goat. And so we see these kind of beginnings of how we're going to take care of ethics by how we're going to take care of the plants, how we're going to take care of the animals, and how we're going to take care of those around us. And probably the next kind of step that we see is as these communities expand, around 4,000 or 3,000 BCE, we see civilization start to form. And we see civilization form based on agriculture, because now, as we've learned through domestication of plants and animals, that I can actually overproduce. And so we have industrialized farming. And I know we think industrialized farming is the last century thing, but really it started in 4,000 or 5,000 BCE. Producing more crop than you needed. And so all of a sudden it has value in trade, or it can sustain others. So others don't have to farm. In fact, they could do things like make pottery, or make my tools, or make my fabric, or lead my religion. And I would produce the food and they would do their duty. And so we see all of a sudden divisions of all kinds of commerce and aspects of society and civilizations form. And we see the beginning of agricultural trade, whether it be this micro trade. I'm going to trade my commodity with you for your commodity, whether that be grain for pottery, or whether we would trade in a macro way between communities. And all of a sudden, my community has excess agricultural product, but we'd like to have product from your community. And we start to see trade occur between communities. And of course, when all of that happens, then we see the emergence of rules and laws and policies, and then the foundations of ethics occurring with that. And a lot of these early ethical agricultural kind of occurrences were really religious based. Right and wrong tended to have its foundations in religion. We were kind of commanded to live and behave in certain ways. And so there's this all the time, this relationship between agriculture and religion in its early ethical basis. So let's move forward to modern agriculture. So we've moved from 4,000 BCE, 6,000 years later to 7,000 years later to the 21st century. And here we are. What are some of the challenges that agriculture faces today? Well, in the world today, we face hunger. There are about 800 million people, 10% of the people worldwide, the United Nations and the FAO say face severe hunger. And actually, it's been increasing during the last 2+ years of the pandemic. We have hungry people. What's interesting is we produce food in excess, but we face global hunger. And then we have a looming future that by the year 2050, it's expected we'll have somewhere between 9 and 10 billion, that should be billion, not million, 9 and 10 billion people on the earth. That's a 24% increase. By 2050, there will be more living people on the earth than have existed in the last 100,000 years. How do we feed them? Because if we think about it, the world is not expanding, only the number of mouths is expanding. And in fact, to some extent, because of climate change, the world is getting smaller. So let's think about climate change. And I know you've had some conversations about climate change already. With the current anthropogenic climate change, the human-induced climate change because of emission of carbon-based gases that are trapping heat and raising the global temperature, which, by the way, 2021 was the hottest global temperature year ever recorded, and we have the highest content of global carbon dioxide was recorded in March of this past year, ever recorded, record-breaking during your lifetime. So what are the impacts? Well, we're losing agricultural land. There's decreasing arable land because of rising temperatures and evaporation. There's increasing desertification. There's the loss of arable soils because of bad farming practices, destruction of soils, erosion, both by water and by wind, and increasing water erosion because of what's happening in our precipitation events. Also, with expanding populations, we have expanding urban areas. And it's particularly in countries like the United States. If we look at our urban areas, many of our urban areas were formed either around two things: the ability to ship by sea or the ability to grow agriculture by land. And so ship by sea or grow by land. And so the communities that are formed by growing by land, which are expanding, are consuming the very land upon which those urban areas were founded. We have a decreasing water resource available. Part of that is with rising global temperatures, we have increased evaporation and a greater opportunity for our stratosphere to hold water. So there's more water in the stratosphere now than there has been in millennia. So less water on our global earth, it's particularly fresh water, and more water in the atmosphere. And so there's less water available for us. We're also, because of all of this and how we use water, we have a loss of our stored underground water reserve of our water aquifers. We have significant changes in weather patterns. We're having warmer temperatures, you see that. Now, not just our daytime temperatures, and most of us as humans, we recognize our daytime temperatures. But from a biological standpoint, what's really important is nighttime temperatures. And it's nighttime temperatures where we see the greatest daily increase. Because what happens, the idea of the greenhouse effect, as solar radiation comes in and is reflected back up, it's reflected continuing through the night. It's nighttime temperature that is trapped by the atmosphere with these greenhouse gases. And so nighttime temperatures are increasing. And so if we think that animals or plants in kind of an anthropogenic way or anthropomorphic way rest during the night, their respirations are increasing at night because respiration is driven by temperature. So higher nighttime temperatures means higher respiration of plants and animals during the nighttime, which means less reserve for agricultural use. So we really, this warming is a really important issue. We're seeing extended warming seasons, and these temperatures, these increased warming seasons have tremendous impacts on our soil. One of the components of soil is organic matter, and organic matter in soil is composed of both the living and dead organic matter, decaying worms and roots and microorganisms. Those decrease and decay at a more rapid rate in high temperatures. So not only are we seeing air temperatures increase globally, we're seeing soil temperatures increase globally. as soil temperatures increase globally, organic matter is decaying at a more rapid rate, actually releasing more carbon dioxide, producing more greenhouse gas, a terrible feedback loop to it. And so when we lose organic matter of the soils become less productive, less arable for that. The other thing that we're seeing, and we're seeing this locally, you're seeing it in your lifetime, more destructive weather events, increased hailstorms, increased flooding events, increased tornadoes, increased hurricanes, increased snowstorms, increased ice storms, greater variation in temperatures during the transition seasons of spring and fall. Hot one day, cold next day. I mean, it's remarkable. Here, even in Fayetteville, 10 days ago, we had 4 days of record warm temperatures, the 4 warmest daytime and nighttime temperatures in recorded history in Fayetteville, which is about 150 years. And then this week, we had some of the coolest daytime temperatures. The high temperature in Fayetteville yesterday was 54 degrees. That's 30 degrees below normal. This is the kind of variation we see in the springtime. That is really tough on plants and animals. This lots of variation in the climate and temperature is very difficult. So climate change is an important aspect, really challenging agriculture. Economics challenges our agriculture production. Production costs are increasing. You're hearing about this on the nightly news. A significant component of the price of food that you pay for at the grocery store is based on the transportation cost. Diesel fuel this week hit its record high in American history in unadjusted dollars. Most of our food is transported by diesel-based transportation systems, either on train or by truck. And so the price that you're paying at the grocery store, which hurts all of us, is going up because of what's happening with the fuel economy, technology resources, and the access to technology resources. And technology resources include a whole range of things, including plant genetic technologies, chemical technologies, machinery technologies, and scientific typical IT technology. The pandemic hurt a lot of these technology resources, slowed down the process. As a result, there's a lot of supply chain issues. And I know that we've talked about supply chain in this class. Another issue is labor. Labor is one of the most expensive components of the agricultural production system. And right now there's a shortage of labor. And so all of a sudden labor becomes a real complex, and I'm not really going to talk about it, but we can, becomes a complex topic for agriculture. In the United States, we rely on about 1 million immigrant, migrant, guest laborers who are allowed into this country to do work. Now, a lot of people said we shouldn't allow them in because the ethical thing to do would be let Americans have those jobs. Well, if Americans don't want to have those jobs, and apparently they don't, or there wouldn't be a market for people that want to come in and do those jobs. If we suddenly say, let's don't allow migrant labor to come in, do we create an ethical issue because all of a sudden there's an economic issue in an adjoining country to the United States because now their people don't have any form of economic family support? They don't have a job. Or do we say that's that country's responsibility? We don't have to worry about it. We're not going to worry about our neighbor's economy. We're only going to worry about our economy. If we think about what happens when food doesn't get harvested. Last year, the strawberry crop in California was about 22% unharvested because there was insufficient labor to harvest the crop. So the crop rotted in the field. We wasted food. Is it ethical for us to waste food? If it's not ethical for us to waste food, how do we get it harvested? If there's not people to harvest it, what do we do? Well, this year we planted about 20% less strawberries. So we'll probably get them all harvested during this season, but there will be a shortage of supply of strawberries. As a result of the shortage supply of strawberries, strawberry prices this year are up about 30% in the grocery store. So consumers are going to pay more because of supply chain issues and supply demand issues for strawberries. So labor is a big issue for us. And then the global economy. About 15 or 17% of American agriculture is used in international trade. An additional 5 or 7% is used in international diplomacy, USAID, given to the United Nations, sent to countries that are starving. So the food that we grow in the United States is actually part of a global market. So the global market's important. Geopolitics, trade balances. Our most important trade partner for agriculture is China. And if you're paying attention to the evening news, we're having a lot of tension with China right now. One of the largest wheat producers in the world is Ukraine. Their markets are being blocked because the seaport at Mariupol is being blocked by Russia. So that wheat is not getting out to the world. So there's a global shortage of wheat right now. So lots of influences on that. If you were listening to National Public Radio this morning, you heard kind of the good and bad news of the global currency exchange rate. The dollar is one of the most strong, it's at one of its strongest points in the last 30 years in currency exchange. I pay attention to this because we have a lot of operations in Europe, and the dollar to the euro is the lowest it has been in 25 years today, or yesterday when I looked. And so our dollar is strong. But what does that mean? That means the rest of the world is not going to buy American products because they can't afford, because our dollar exchange rate is too strong. And then consumer incomes. As consumers have disposable income, they make food buying decisions. And with tight incomes right now, facing inflation, rising home prices, rising fuel prices, Americans are making food decisions to switch the kind of foods that they eat or eat less of some things. So that has a big impact on us. Okay, so when I talk about agriculture and farming, let's kind of get some perspective on what we really mean for that. Worldwide, there are about 570 million farmers, and that's somewhere around 7 to 8% of the population of the world are involved in agriculture. It is actually one of the largest human endeavors globally. It's a little bit different in the United States, and I'll get to that. Now, if we look at that farming enterprise, we can break it down into two kind of broad stroke categories. First would be commercial industrial farming. This is primarily what we practice in the developed world, and it can vary in scale and complexity. But what I mean by commercial industrial farming is we produce products to sell, and not just for self-consumption. And of course, this is compared to what we might consider primitive farming, subsistent farming. 84% of the people involved in the global farming enterprise are subsistent farmers. What I mean by subsistent, they produce enough or barely enough for their own consumption, for that household consumption. This is survival farming, day-to-day living. Now, the largest percentage of farmers are subsistent survival farmers, but the largest amount of food produced comes from commercial industrial agriculture. Let's look at farming in the United States so we can start to understand how decisions are made and the perspectives that are used. Farmers in the United States are independent business persons. They own their operation. They make independent decisions, a decision that might be different than their neighbor's decision. Farming is very much a science-based and technology-driven business. And probably this is a benchmark of the United States agriculture, really created by innovations such as the Land Grant Agricultural Act of 1863, creating universities like the Arkansas Industrial Mechanical University, now called the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, where we have a College of Agriculture completely dedicated to developing science and technology to assist Arkansas farmers. And this was deployed across the United States. And so we see this 19th century deployment of science and technology to drive agriculture. It's a very resource intensive operation. We tend to think that about there's probably a 10% profit margin on most agricultural farms. 90% of the cost of a farm operation is in this resource utilization. Inputs, labor, technology, land ownership. And so we use a lot of resources, and we're going to talk about some of those resources. Farming is inherently destructive. We're taking natural existing ecosystems and changing them into a domesticated ecosystem. Now, I say destructive, and that it is destructive, but we mitigate that destructiveness and the impact of that destructiveness with sustainable agricultural practices if they're employed. So probably for the next hour, as we go through the class, we're going to think about what affects farming business decisions and what affects those choices. And then we want to think about how does that intersect or overlap with farming ethical choices? And are there really ethical choices in farming? So back to agroethics. When we're talking about this, we want to contemplate the things that you've been contemplating for 2 weeks. What is right and what is wrong? And is there delineation always between them? Are they binary? Are they black and white? Or is there gray? And really, in terms of agroethics, that what we try to search for are there moral imperatives? Are there universal ethics that we should employ? What I mean by a moral imperative or a universal ethic, and I'm sure this example has been used, we would all probably agree murder is morally wrong. We have a universal ethic that says murder is wrong, unless we're going to allow the execution of a criminal, in which case it's publicly allowed murder by society. And so, there again, even a universal imperative, a universal moral idea of murder, well, we might hedge our bets on that and say, well, murder is generally wrong, but societal murder as revenge for a crime is acceptable or allowable. Maybe not acceptable, but allowable. When we think about agroethics, then who gets to make those decisions about what is right and wrong? And really, is it the rights of the individual? Does a farmer have the right to determine right and wrong? Or is that a social responsibility, a societal responsibility? So all of a sudden we have this kind of interplay between the individual and society. And I know you've wrestled with this for the last couple of weeks. But in agriculture, this becomes very, very pronounced because it becomes the point of conflict that we might see in several of these. And so when we think about agricultural ethics, there's lots of ambiguity. There's lots of grayness. There's a lot of shadow. And I'm going to be intentionally ambiguous at various points of our conversation today because I want to stimulate the idea of understanding ethics and perspectives which might craft or lead ethics. So, and we kind of think, where did our ethical basis for agriculture start? Well, some of the earliest written documents might be religious texts. And so if we go back to the religious text of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and I'm not a biblical scholar and I don't mean to portray that, but this is often used by agricultural ethicists as kind of foundational content, and it's used to argue actually both sides of a coin. So if we look back to religious text, Genesis, we were commanded to fill the earth and subdue it and rule over it. Our command was to dominate the earth. Now, what does that really mean? And I'm not a Greek or a Hebrew scholar, so I have not gone back to try to interpret the original script. But if you look at the various translations of 127, you'll see words like master, dominion, command, etc. So dominion, dominate, rule over every creature, that we're the top, we're the decision makers in this. And so if I'm a farmer, I'm the decision maker to rule over my part of the earth, rule over the creatures for which I'm responsible or I'm taking care of. If we look further into that chapter, we were actually told we were put in the garden specifically to cultivate it and keep it. Now, this particular sense is used again in an ethical perspective discussion. So cultivate it is our primary responsibility. Cultivation, farming, whatever the cost is, producing food. And again, I haven't gone back. I'm not a biblical scholar, and I don't speak Hebrew or Greek. So I don't know the words really in those primary languages from where this was interpreted. But cultivate, does that mean to produce? Many farmers and ethicists will say our primary responsibility to the world is to cultivate the world, to produce food, and to keep it. Ecologists look at that particular part of the phrase and say our primary responsibility is to sustain our garden, being our globe, sustain it in an ecological way. And so this becomes part of an ethical conversation. Are we driven ethically to produce food at whatever cost? Or are we ethically driven to keep the world at its best sustainable level at whatever cost? And so it's a very kind of prescient part of it. What are some other kind of pretexts we have for agroethics? Well, we see things such as the fair treatment of labor, that actually nobody should have to work 7 days. You should work in the field for 6 days, and on the 7th day, you actually deserve rest. And so we've actually created an entire system of employment kind of around that. And we typically in agriculture, the typical agricultural work week is a 6-day work week. I know the business and the school week is a 5-day work week. But if I was a farmer out there, I would say that I have a 6-day work week. I have to work those 6 days. But because of a 3,000-year-old text, I'm going to take 1 day off. I hope I'm going to take 1 day off. What about the ethical treatment of land? Well, the concept of leaving land fallow, again, has a biblical, kind of a pretext to it. On the 7th year, you let it rest and lie fallow. And now, why would we do that? Well, we actually do that to let the land rest and recuperate. But there are two different expressions here or statements here between Exodus and Leviticus. One, on the 7th year, you don't harvest it. You let it go wild and natural. But you allow people that need food to go in and glean that food from it. And you let animals that need it, and you let it kind of restore a natural balance in an ecosystem. So this idea of a fallow year that we still employ in agriculture, and we argue whether the fallow year, and it varies from crops, should be the 3rd year, the 5th year, or the 7th year, or the 15th year. And so there's been research around this for hundreds of years now about what should the fallow year be, the Sabbath or the Shemitah year. During the 7th year, let your land rest. What about food access, sharing the harvest? In Leviticus, again, it says, harvest what you can from your crop, and what you don't harvest, let others come in and gather, let them glean. And this is used as the basis for a lot of nonprofit NGO gleaning organizations right now. Realistically, in our modern agricultural system, and particularly the horticulture system, with our modern technology, we harvest somewhere between, I'll say, 90 and 95% of everything that is on a plant. There's always somewhere between 1 and 10% that falls to the ground, is missed by the machine or missed by a picker. Well, gleaning organizations say that's unused food that we should be able to go back in and find. And so they glean that. Well, there's actually allowing people that need to have food should have an ethical reason to get that food. In a New Testament script in 2 Timothy, it says that farmers should be the ones that we take care of first. They should receive the first fruits of their labor. And that actually is used as in kind of how we determine our farm bill in the United States. We want to take care of our farmers first. We want to create the right kind of economic system for our farmers so that they get taken care of, because if our farmers are not taken care of, they go out of business. And if we go out of business, then there is no food. And so it's important that farmers be fed, that farmers be sustained. So this is kind of where we start to see these texts for the ethics around agriculture start to emerge and occur for us. So how are they deployed? Well, again, it's an independent business. Although we talk about it like it's an industry and we coalesce the notion of it as an industry, there are independent thinkers in this. Now, there are community standards. There could be local residential community standards, but there might be industry standards. For instance, the dairy industry has employed animal welfare standards if you're going to be American dairy producers. There are governmental policies, regulations, and laws that enforce our ethics for this and becomes an important part of it. So how do farmers make these decisions? And what influences? Well, we know ethical decisions, as you've talked about over the last week, are influenced by culture, demographics, politics, and religion. So let's look at farming in the United States. Let's drill in to understand that. In the United States, there are 2 million farms on about 900,000 acres of land. There are 3.1 million producers. These are people actually actively involved in the production of agricultural products. That's less than 1% of the American population. We have the most efficient agricultural production system in the United States, in the world, and actually the cheapest food in the world as a result of our efficiencies in this. If I take everybody that's involved in the agricultural supply chain, manufacturing, distribution system, it gets to be about 3% of the population of the United States. But if we're talking about farm ethics, there's about 3 million farmers making 3.1 million independent decisions. 98% of the farmers own their own land and the resources underneath. They own that land, that soil resource, and in most cases, the water underneath, or even the mineral rights underneath. There are exceptions to that. 90% of the farms in the United States are considered large family farms. And a large family farm is considered any farm that makes more than $1 million a year in farm gate sales. Now let's put that in perspective, because it actually sometimes is misleading. As I said earlier, kind of a benchmark we like to think is farms have a 10% profit margin. So if you are a large farm making $1 million a year, your profit would be $100,000. So $100,000 is a reasonable income. And so a lot of our farms fall into that category. Now, of those large farms, if we get, there's a very small percentage of it, 4.8% of them produce more than 50% of all of the food products in the United States. So essentially, 5% of our farms produce almost 60% of the food, and 95% of the farms produce 40% of the food that we eat. What are the demographics of our farmers? Well, they're 95% Caucasian, white. They're 64% male, and they're pretty old. The average age of the American farmer is 55. 34% are 64 years old or older. And it's a phenomena we call graying of the American farm. We're quite concerned by that. But suffice it to say, okay, they're white, male, 55. What are their political affiliations? Well, a recent poll, the most recent I could find in 2016, indicates that about 70% are Republican or lean Republican, 12% independent, 15% Democrat. So 3/4 conservative. I could not find really good statistics, and this is a question I've been looking at for years, on the religious affiliations of agriculture. First off, the USDA and the government doesn't ever ask religious questions. And so there's no really good information on that. But a survey that I've used for other purposes before was the American Communities Project, Understanding Religion in the United States. In rural communities, and so if we say that agriculture are largely rural communities, they're about 83% affiliated Christian, and a third would consider themselves evangelical Christians. What's their educational attainment? 49% have some high school degree or less, 51% have some college, 21% have a college degree or advanced degrees. What does land use look like in farming in the United States? Well, if you look at it, we have a lot of land committed to one thing, and that's cows. Cows in pasture. 41% of the land used in the United States is committed to pasture animals, cows particularly. And if we look at other aspects of that, we can see the largest aspect of crop production is committed to livestock feed. So producing additional food, more than what they can graze on. If we look at the food that we eat directly, crops grown for us to eat, it's about 12% of our land use area. So when we post this, you can go back and look at it, but I want you to understand how we're using our land. A lot of private timber land, which is agricultural land, a very small amount of wilderness left in the United States. At any one time, about 7 or 9% of our land is fallow and not being used. What about the size of our farming sector? So I've kind of broken it down into cash crops, which would be plant crops, and animal crops. Well, you can see our largest component of plant crops would be corn and soybeans. 36% of the corn that we grow is for animal feed. The soybeans, 70% of the soybeans we grow are for animal feed, either inside of the United States or through international trade. What about in our animal sectors? Cattle and dairy, and of course, both are cows, make up almost 2/3 of the sales that we have in agriculture in the animal sectors. Of course, locally, we pay attention to poultry because that's an important business here in Arkansas. Realistically, in Arkansas, cattle is one of our largest agricultural businesses. We have about 80,000 cow managing farms in the state of Arkansas. More people farm cows in Arkansas than the totality of all of the rest of the farms that we have on a farm number basis. So, I don't want to start to criminalize cattle farming because those are people that manage those farms. So we have 80,000 families in Arkansas that raise cows. If we suddenly would say, well, cows aren't a good thing, what do those 80,000 families do? Where do they get their income from? Do we have some moral obligation to maintain them? So the rest of this time that I have left, about 30 minutes, and I hope to stimulate some questions. I'm going to go over kind of quickly some of the big agro-ethical issues, things agro-ethicists talk about. And then we can come back and you can ask about any of those individual ones and we can talk about those. So, is agriculture inherently good? Well, I want to tell you, farmers think so. Farmers think that they are stewards of the land. They were put on this earth to cultivate and keep the land. They are a public service that 9/10, less than 1% of the American population feeds the 99%. It's inherently good. They see that. It's a public good. It's something that is ethically inherently good. However, maybe other people think differently. Some polls in 2 decades ago showed that the majority of Americans had negative feelings about agriculture. Now, part of that was based because of some things that were happening at that time, particularly around agricultural chemicals, farm closures, farm economy, and rising food prices at the time. I'm a little concerned right now. I'm hearing things on what I'll call the general media of consumers saying, food prices are so high. What's happening out there on the farm? Well, again, the complexity of food prices, when a large portion of that is transportation, supply chain, and manufacturing, it's not necessarily the farmer's not getting necessarily a profit because of inflation in food prices. It's a supply demand issue. So a lot of the public have a negative image of agriculture. They think it's inherently bad. Why would they think it's inherently bad? Well, agriculture produces about 11% of the totality of greenhouse gases produced by the United States, which is one of the largest greenhouse gas producers in the world. It is one of the largest sectors aside from industry being number one, excuse me, it's third, industry, transportation, then agriculture, as the 3 largest contributors to greenhouse gases. Is it inherently good? Agriculture is the largest source of non-point source pollution, both water pollution by soil and by chemicals, by eutrophication for runoff from fertilizers that are not consumed in the production process, by wind erosion, by the aerial aspirates of using agricultural chemicals. It's a large polluter. Is agriculture inherently good? And I'll mention more about this as an issue itself. Agriculture is the largest user of water, both globally and inside of the United States. So is agriculture inherently good, or is it inherently bad? And how do we correct that? What about land ownership and stewardship of the soil resource? 3.1 million independent farmers who own their land. Are they responsible for their land, or is there a greater societal responsibility? Should farmers be able to determine what I want to grow, when I want to grow it, how I want to grow it? Or should there be a societal viewpoint on this? Should society say what you should grow, how you should grow it, when you should grow it? And what I mean by society, that becomes employed through our farm policy, our policies, regulations, and laws that govern that. Should sustainable land practices be mandated, or should that be the ethical decision of those 3 million independent business decision makers? So that becomes kind of a big issue. From a farm standpoint, you have to look at the time scale for this, the long run versus the short run. Should I do what is ever necessary to maximize the profitability of my farm this year so that my family can achieve the American dream, so that I can make a sustainable personal wage, so that I can own my house in my land, so that I can send my children to college, so that I can own a vehicle, so that I can connect to the internet, so that I can afford health care? Or do I reduce my profitability and look at the long term for sustainability, or change my production practices, which may increase costs, or reduce my productivity, reducing my margin, my profit margin? Do I do what is best for my family today? That's an ethical decision. Or do I do what's best for society tomorrow? It's a complex ethical decision. This is the nexus between the individual, the short term, and the societal long term that drives sustainable agriculture. Food access. Should we provide food access? Do farmers have responsibility to facilitate food access? There are organizations that are gleaning, organizations that come in to recover food that is unharvested, left in the field, either because it could not be harvested or it wouldn't make grade. For instance, I have visited lettuce and cabbage farms in California, and if the standard head of cabbage has to be 9 inches in diameter, a 6-inch head of cabbage, which is completely edible, has no market value. It could not be sold in the market. It cannot go into the supply chain. So that's left in the field. So does a farmer have a responsibility to allow people to go in and get that? Or is it their land and they want to recover that biomass because it's going to add organic matter to the soil and make their production system better next year? Do gleaning organizations have the right to go on to private owned land and glean food? That's an ethical kind of question. Even locally, I've seen this in a farmer's market. When I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years with our local farmers markets. And we've created, actually one of my honor students was working on this. We created a food recovery program associated with our farmers market, that at the end of the sales day at a farmer's market, if they had fresh produce that they know they could not sell, there was no market for that, would they donate that to this food recovery program so that we could give it to food banks? Interestingly enough, we found a lot of farmers that said, yes, no problem, I'm going to do that. We had other farmers that said, no, I'm not going to do that because there's no reason I should do that. In fact, I'm going to feed that to my animals, and it's going to supplement my animal feed. So it's going to reduce the cost of the food that I have to buy for my animals, which reduce my production costs, which is going to make it affordable for me to sell my animals. And I know even my honor students said, is that ethical for them to waste food by feeding their own animals? Is it ethical? They're feeding their animals so they can sell their animals to consumers, so consumers have food, but it also will drive the economy for their family, help them achieve the American dream. There is no financial reason for a farmer to donate food because there's a maximum allowed in our US tax code that allows donations of your product to tax deductible organizations. So once you reach that maximum, there's no incentive to do that. So is it ethical to take advantage of a tax? Should we have tax incentives? Should we raise the tax incentive so we'd be more likely to give more product to food banks or not? So what about the government? So we actually overproduce food in the United States. And I'm going to give you some rough estimates. If the average American consumer consumes about 2,000 calories a day in the United States, we produce annually, year-round in our food system, somewhere between 4,500 calories and 6,000 calories per day. So we overproduce food. Some of that food we ship, some of that food we lose in the process. That means that there's a supply-demand problem. We have oversupply, which will drive down the prices, so the demand meets prices, which means the profitability of our farmers goes down, which means it's not profitable to grow that product. So the government can intervene, and the government started doing this after World War I, would buy excess food, take it out of the supply chain so that the supply of food would go down. And as a result, the demand would go up. And so the price of food would go up. So it was an artificial price support. And the idea was we would take food out. Well, we still sort of do that. We actually gave that food at those points in time until the 1960s. We gave it to people that did not have food access. In the 1960s, we created the food stamp program and now the SNAP program, where we give them money to go buy their own food. We don't take it out of the supply chain, but we still take a certain percentage of food out of the supply chain to reduce supply. And we use that food that we took out of the supply chain by government, and we use that for diplomatic purposes. That's what we feed the starving people around the world. Does the United States have a moral imperative, an ethic reason to feed people of other countries? Is there any ethical reason to do that? We overproduce food. We actually know taking food out of our supply will reduce the supply available, drives up demand, increases prices, makes farming profitable. We could destroy that food. Some countries do that. And actually, we have done that. We've actually had farmers do that, destroy food so that we reduce supply to drive up prices. So is there an ethical imperative that the United States, as an overproducer of food, should feed the world? Interesting question. Talk about. What about farm size and farm technology? I told you that the majority of farms in the United States are considered large, even though we tend to think about this ideal small farm. The average farm in the United States is about 440 acres. The average farm in Arkansas is about 2,000 acres. We're larger than most. I think when we think about the ideal American farmer, we probably think of 100 acres and some cows and pigs and chickens. And we actually have farms like that, but it's in the 1% kind of range. So right now, a certain portion of our farms are considered, about 30% of our 10% of our farms are considered small scale farms. That means they make less than $350,000 a year. They fit that ideal American farm, that small farmer that's subsisting and selling excess. Well, if they make $350,000 a year, gross farm sales, with again a 10% profit margin, that means that they're making for that household $35,000 a year, which would be at poverty standards. So that small American farmer, that ideal farmer, is living in poverty, although they're providing food for us. And this is actually true at a lot of our farmers markets. Most of our farmers markets, their farms are secondary sources of income. The owners of that farm are doing other things. Of this group of farmers, the less than large farmers, 12% of American farmers have no health insurance. They lack access to health care because of insufficient farm incomes. That's the number one determinant in that. Do we as a country have an ethical obligation to support the health of our farmers? About 40% have no retirement account. Their retirement account is their land. And so they have to sell their land when they retire so they can gain the equity of their ownership. And that's what they retire off of. So what about expanding farm size? As we expand farm size, we increase profitability. We increase the enterprise. We increase the family household sustainability. As we employ technology, we gain efficiencies. In all of those, we start to displace people. As we increase farm size and employ technology, keeping the price of food low for the 99% of us that aren't farmers, we're displacing people from the farm. We're taking them out of their livelihood. and making them make new life decisions? Is there an ethical responsibility to allow people to farm, to stay on the farm? And if so, how do we do that? Other countries have ways that they have found to sustain that. In our country, free market capitalistic society, we don't have a safety net for our farmers realistically. But we want low price of food. We have federal policies that keep food prices low, the lowest of any in terms of our disposable income, the lowest of any place in the world. So kind of an interesting, farm size is increasing, displacing people. Technology is increasing, displacing people. Yeah. Environmental stewardship, and I know you've talked about global climate change, and I've mentioned that here. We have some pretty dramatic examples about, and this is where science and technology, which as we heard in our very first lecture, are probably inherently ethically neutral. It's the deployment of science and technology that creates ethical problems or technological problems. So we learned how to farm wheat with high yielding wheat and how to plow and cultivate the soil. And we took over the Great Plains of the United States, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and we took grazing grasslands away from native grazing animals, buffalo, antelope, deer, and we plowed that land. And we created a large monoculture of wheat, particularly winter wheat, because in those areas, which typically have low rainfall in the summer, we could plant the grain in the fall, get fall precipitation. They would grow, be dormant during the winter, covered with snow. Then they would grow again in the springtime, mature in April and May. We could harvest them in May and June and have a bumper crop of wheat. We'd cultivate it, and to eliminate summer weeds from occurring, we'd immediately plow the ground, and we'd have bare ground during June, July, and August, during the hottest periods of the month, which created a microclimate of heat exchange between the earth and the air, which created wind currents, which led to the Dust Bowl. So tremendous misdeployment of science and technology without thinking about the unintended consequence. So the Dust Bowl was a great example. Now we have to think about the unintended environmental consequence of all of our science and technology decisions. How do we deal with the idea that agriculture is the greatest non-point source polluter of water and of air in the United States? How do we deal with the idea that it's the third most important aspect of greenhouse gas contribution? This is where environmental ethics overlap with agricultural ethics, and we might have new terminology of eco-agro ethics. Actually, my personal kind of philosophy on this that led me to work on sustainable agricultural practices, that combining my personal eco-environmental ethicism, growing up during I was in college during the early days of Earth Day. I also was moved into agriculture because of the Green Revolution. The idea, can I feed the world? The Green Revolution. Can I save the world from itself? The Earth Day notion. So eco-agro ethics kind of start to emerge. The water resource. Water drives agricultural production. 75% of the use of fresh water globally and in the United States is used in the production of food. 75%. We are damming naturally running streams and rivers so that we can retain water to produce food. That's creating ecosystem damages, natural migration of migratory fish species. It's changing that ecosystem. It's limiting piscian species availability. We're pumping water out of the ground. I own the water underneath my farm, so I'm going to pump that water up. And we have declining water reserve aquifers. And in fact, through this use of agriculture, We're increasing evaporation rates compared to natural evaporation rates. So we're using water, we're contributing to climate change and water evaporation by the way we use water. So what's the ethical thing to do on water use? Do we say we're going to ban high water using crops? Are we going to ban, is it the right thing to do to ban water taken from streams to dam streams, or to pump water from aquifers? Or do we do it what's in California where they say, well, sorry, we're going to divert water from these areas of California to other areas of California to sustain agriculture. And sorry, you farmers, you're going out of business because the state has decided these farms are more important than your farms. We made a social decision. Or do the people of Los Angeles that need water to drink, to flush their toilets, and to water plants, do we say they have more ethical right to water than the people that are producing food in California? Who has ethical ownership of that water resource? A lot of controversy around that. Animal welfare and animal rights. Often in agricultural circles, I've heard, and I don't mean to offend anybody, who says animals have rights? We have a Bill of Rights. We have constitutional rights. We have God-given rights. What are the rights of animals? If we have biblical text that says we should have dominion over the animals, we should dominate the animals. That means our rights exceed their rights. And so this is a controversial ethical question. But animal welfare, appropriate care of animals, is important. So what is our ethical responsibility for animal care? And where do those delineate themselves? Is producing animals and confined animal agriculture, but providing them adequate water, food, nutrition, veterinary care, is that an ethical way to raise animals? Or let them graze in outside where they might die of natural causes, they might gather disease, or they might be eaten by other animals. So animals that we have domesticated, they don't exist in the wild. They cannot exist without our care. So where does our ethical care responsibility for animals start and end? What about animal slaughter? If we're going to eat animals, and we are an animal eating culture, particularly in the United States, we have to kill them. What's the ethical way to kill an animal? Do we want to kill them with the least pain? Or does the amount of pain matter? So those are questions that we wrestle with in agroethics. Let's drill down to meat. As I said earlier, 41% of the land area in the United States is committed to red meat production. Is it ethical for us to eat red meat, to use that much land? This by itself contributes between 3 and 4% of the greenhouse gases in the United States. There's more greenhouse gases from red meat production than from consumer households in total. If we want to change the environment, do we change the way we live in our house, or do we change our eating consumption? Is it ethical to eat red meat? Some vegans say it's unethical. It's unethical because of environmental ethics. It's unethical because of animal treatment ethics. So red meat by itself becomes a hot button ethical discussion. Genetics, and I know you've talked about genetics and genetic manipulation. We've discussed that a little bit, but this is very important in our agricultural ethics. Should an individual or a company be able to own a gene? And what's the importance of owning a gene? Well, if I own that gene, whether it be from a plant or any other organism, and I can alter another plant, I can create a new plant. And then I can own the genetics of that plant. And I can control that, and I can create market value around that. So the genetic ownership is an issue. Plant ownership, because of genetics, is important. And I even had a personal issue with this. So part of my background, I was an apple breeder for 15 years, and I was about to release an apple that I thought had the opportunity to have market impact. And I wanted to patent it. And there was this guy in Massachusetts that he was known nationwide. It was so against plant patents. He went after me, of all people, that I was going to patent this plant. Well, one of the ideas of patenting a plant is that you have to control it while it's going through the patent process and not release it. It cannot be publicly accessible. So he threatened to sue the university about patenting the plant. And of course, we knew he wouldn't sue us. So I was going through the process. Well, what he did is he found one of my collaborators at a research farm. He went in and quite illegally took some wood off of one of the apple trees that I was going to patent, and he propagated it and distributed it all across the United States to farmers. And he said, Curt can now no longer patent this plant because it's been distributed. It's out in public. The public owns it, not the University of Arkansas. And of course, he goes, I know you can sue me. I also know you won't. And we didn't. And so I didn't patent that plant. And in fact, because there was no patent, no nursery wanted to produce the plant. And although it's grown in very small circles, it never has been accessible to the general public as much as it would because of this individual who disrupted the process, because he believed we should not own genes and patent plants. There's an issue right now that's probably going to go to court, that there was an apple variety patented in Washington state. And the patents, when they patented it, the owner said, this apple will only be grown in the state of Washington because the majority of funding came from taxpayers of Washington. Well, somebody in a different state said, aha, that is true, the majority, but Washington State University receives federal dollars, which are supported by the general population. And so even if there was only 1 cent out of $1 million put into that plant development, the rest of the United States should have access to growing this wonderful apple. It can't be limited to Washington. So I'm gonna be interested to see what the courts say about that. Who will win there, whether the growers of Washington who collectively own this variety, or this business in a different state will win that. So genetics, related to genetics is genetic modification of food. We've been employing genetic modification for about 10,000 years. We've been selecting plants that grew well. In the Neolithic period, if I had 2 grass plants and one produced a whole lot of seed, that's the one I kept. I genetically improved that plant by selecting better yielding varieties. In the last 150 years, because of Mendelian genetics and genetic theory and understanding of genetics, we've been able to create what we say traditional breeding, hybridizing crops to improve varieties and cultivars. In the last 30 years, we've understood biotechnology, where I can take a gene of another variety or of interest, or another plant of interest, or another organism of interest, and improve my plant. And so I'm creating new things. Now, as a plant breeder, I'm very enthusiastic about biotechnology, because for me to develop an apple would be about a 25-year process, because the time I plant a seed, I don't get my first apple on the tree for 15 years. Through biotechnology, I can get a first apple on the tree in 2 years, and I can see how it could do, and I could mass produce it quite quickly, and it could have impact. I could reduce the use of pesticides. I could reduce the use of insecticides. I could reduce the use of fertilizers. I could reduce, pollution. I could have a better, more sustainable system with a genetic modified plant, but a lot of controversial ethical issues around that. What about the conversion to organics? A lot of the early organic philosophies were based on an ethical decision-making process, that conventional farming based on the use of synthetic chemicals is unethical. because growing plants and animals is a natural-based system that we should avoid using synthetic inputs and revert to a natural-based system. Now, I studied organic production scientifically for 20-some years, both from an ethical perspective as well as a scientific perspective. We didn't understand the science behind it, but I wanted to create a science-based technology for growers that were making ethical decisions. In the United States, a survey done in 2011 of organic farmers found that 21% of the organic farmers in the United States did that moved to organics or produced organically for environmental or food safety considerations. 21%, a different 21% said their primary motivator for farming organically was for farm income. It was better for my family. So if I look at those two combined, organic farmers are capitalists with a conscience. I don't like to get into a strong ethical confrontation between organic and conventional production because they are two different technologies, but there's a lot of ethical considerations and arguments at the interface. Product processing and packaging facilities and the pandemic. And this is kind of an interesting one that really occurred in the last few years. So let's look at the big picture. Is there an ethical obligation, a moral imperative that in our conventional industrial food system, food that is delivered to consumers should be safe? It should be free of contaminants and free of biological organisms that would have infections, would give infectious disease. Most of us would say yes. Our government says yes. And so we have a lot of food safety rules, and our food is processed and packaged. So what happened during the pandemic? Well, a lot of our food processing companies shut down operations because they were thinking about their workers. They wanted to provide for worker safety, which is also, it's an ethical thing. Our workers producing our food should work in a safe environment. So if we don't understand COVID, we know it's highly infectious. So when we have hundreds of workers in a food processing plant or a meat packaging plant, let's shut down because we know COVID is spread communally until we can figure out what to do. Well, was that the right thing to do? We found out that most of those workers got COVID at their communities because they were living in communities, and there was very little spread inside of the packaging plants. And in fact, in their packaging plants, because of the food safety requirements we have, already wearing masks and hair nets and air filtration systems and chlorination systems and ozonation systems, maybe it was safer for them to be at work than it was for them to be in their communal living environment. As a result of shutting down food processing, we created food shortages and food inflation prices. And we're still seeing that. We have not recovered from the food inflation that occurred from shutting down food processing, shifting supply chains, creating shortages. When we shut down a food packaging facility, we had to tell farmers, sorry, we can't take your food. You'll have to destroy it. We can't package salad. We can't ship tomatoes or strawberries. We can't harvest your chickens. You'll have to destroy that food because there's no way to keep that until they open up again. So what's the obligation we have, ethical obligation about keeping people safe? Kind of the last issue here is kind of a global issue. Do we have a moral imperative? Is there an ethical obligation that we have in the developed world with science-based, technology-driven agriculture to export that and implement that worldwide? If 84% of the farmers of the world are subsistent, starving farmers, And 11% of our global population right now is starving, has inadequate food access. Should we export this technology? Or what's the right for indigenous farming processes? Should we export the idea that growing corn as a nutritious multi-use crop is important into areas where they've never grown corn, or soybeans into areas where they've never grown soybeans, specifically Africa? Should we deploy technology like the use of pesticides so that they have a less damage to their crop, higher yields, where they might move from being a subsistent farmer to a selling farmer? So there's a lot of argument in the agriculture community about indigenous knowledge, westernization of agriculture, the idea of the savior complex. Are we going to go in and save these farms, save them from themselves, in essence? So that kind of brings us all back to these ideas. In terms of agriculture and farming decision-making, what is right, what is wrong, what are our moral imperatives, and are there universal ethics to employ? Who gets to decide what is ethically right, ethically wrong for agriculture? Is it the individual farmer, or are there societal rights that we have with this? And can we live with the ambiguities? So, professors, I think I have run out of my time. So it's time.